Before I get started with today's discussion, a little note about things going forward. You'll notice that this video has premiered on Monday. That's going to be the standard going forward with all the new video premieres. I'm going to be doing them on Monday morning, and I'm going to be doing the actual production work for the videos over the weekend. Previously, I would be doing them during the course of the week, and sometimes things would get into a bit of a mad rush to make sure everything went up on Friday. But from now on, it's going to go up on Monday. It's going to be much easier for me to do these things on a regular schedule. Now that said, if you've been following this channel for a little bit, you may remember a couple of videos back, I did a piece about some books that I picked up when I was visiting friends and family in New York City back at the beginning of July. And one of the books I want to talk about today was in that batch. And it is Eric Hoffer's The True Believer, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements. Now, I have read this book before. It was just such a long time ago that I barely remembered anything about it. And when I started hearing more recent discussion about the book, I felt a little embarrassed that I had read it and not retained any of its contents. So I made a resolution to myself to go find it, to sit down with it, to really read it and digest it. And so when I saw it on the shelves at the Strand in New York back at the beginning of July, I said, yes, let's do this. So the basic premise of the book is it is an examination of the kinds of people who are attracted to and who also tend to engender mass political movements. And the book was originally written in the 1950s. So as you can imagine, Eric Hoffer was drawing on what he saw as being our experiences with the way fascism and communism had been driven by these kinds of mass movements. And the Nazis loomed particularly large in his analysis, if only because we had seen firsthand the truly destructive potential of a mass movement on a nation, both psychically and physically. And the first point that he wants to make is that mass movements draw a person of a very specific kind of psychic construction. They draw people that he describes as being frustrated. These are people who are not necessarily poor. He points out that the abject poor, the people at the absolute bottom of the heap, don't tend to be parts of these movements because they have no hope whatsoever and because they have more or less resigned themselves to their position. Day-to-day life is such a struggle that any ideas about anything bigger are just completely swept off the table. He focuses instead on people who feel that they are just within grasp of something big but can't have it because their daily lives are ruined for whatever reason, and because they themselves are psychically ruined from within. They want great change to be made in their world, and they want to make this great change to compensate for their feelings of hopelessness in their particular moment in time and space. They want something bigger than themselves to live for or die for, because deep down inside, they don't really feel like they have much of anything. And an important point that he makes, not just in the beginning, but throughout the book in various ways, is that these people, again, are not necessarily at the bottom of the heap. In fact, many of them are not at the bottom of the heap. They may be in the middle, though they may be even near the commanding heights of power. But for whatever reason, they feel psychically frustrated. They do not feel like they have what they want, what they deserve. And so they throw their lot in with hope. And hope for them, the hope of creating something that wipes the slate clean, is much more attractive to them than relief. It's more interesting for them to go after something that is open-ended and undefined, a whole new world, than it is to get some specific redress for any specific grievance. Because if they got that specific redress for that specific grievance, they wouldn't have anything more to do. They would be done. Hope is unbounded. It's infinitely renewable. It's an endless source of energy. And another thing that Hoffer explains early on, which I found very interesting, especially in the light of recent events, is he has a very good explanation for people who freely switch sides between, say, the extreme left and the extreme right. For him, what he sees as being really important here is the energy that fanaticism generates on either side of the spectrum, the raw energy, rather than the specific doctrine. It's that energy that is most attractive and animating to certain people. And while these extremes may compete with each other, they are also highly interchangeable. So this may explain why some people who are on the extreme right may rush to the extreme left in another set of circumstances or vice versa, without ever seeming to feel like they're contradicting themselves. For them, there is no contradiction. Everything for them is about the expression of this pure urge towards fanatic hope. And again, the abject, the people at the absolute bottom, are actually far less susceptible to radicalization than people who are just shy of satisfaction. Because again, the former have no hope. The latter have some hope, but it's frustrated hope, and that's even more agonizing. And the way he puts this is, it's not about actual suffering. It's about the taste, the unsatisfied taste of better things that excites people to revolt. Our frustration, he says, is greater when we have much and when we want more than when we have nothing and we want something. We are less dissatisfied when we lack many things than when we seem to lack but one thing. So for him, this frustration, this estrangement from the self because of frustration is a key animating component of people who join mass movements. And he also uses this to unpack how people will fight. Such people will fight hardest for things that don't even exist, rather than things that do exist. Because again, a thing that does not exist has an endless, it's an endless source of this kind of energy. Something that is specific and bounded and finite is not as attractive to these kinds of people. Now, a key thing that you may have picked up from all this discussion is that these people are not animated by actual ideas. They're not animated by thinking. They are animated by a feeling. Hoffer has a very nice aphorism for this. He says, the fanatic cannot be convinced. He is only converted. What's really important to him is to have the feeling, the spiritual animation of being part of something bigger. Arguments, ideas, abstractions, big logical constructions, those are justifications. Those are not things that we use to start someone's conversion. They're things that are used to justify it after the fact. Another key component that he points out for people who are part of these movements is a certain degree of self-contempt. Again, they feel empty within themselves. They feel frustrated. And when they have that, it is something that is much easier to turn outwards at others and turn into this animating power and to become a common goal. It's always easier for the frustrated people to find common enemies and to direct their energy at that enemy, whether that enemy is in fact responsible for any of their grievances or not. He makes a point that many mass movements do have perfectly legitimate grievances. A lot of the grievances that the Nazis were able to exploit in the German psyche were perfectly valid grievances. How they were going to satisfy those grievances is a completely different story. In many cases, they didn't want to satisfy them. They simply wanted to exploit them. And so on the same subject of the emotional components of conversion to fanaticism, there's a discussion of propaganda. And again, that's also about justifying in retrospect. It's not about actually persuading people. It's about arming people with a set of justifications after the fact for whatever it is that they're already emotionally inclined to do. And what's scariest about a lot of those justifications is how they are justifications for violating existing norms in the name of things that do not exist yet or may never exist. To the frustrated, as he puts it, freedom from responsibility is more attractive than freedom from restraint. Now, all of this is delivered in a book that's relatively compact in its argument and in its page count. It's only about 180 pages in the edition that I showed you earlier, but it covers an immense amount of territory in those pages. And it's written in a style that is very compact, very lively, and very aphoristic. Many of the chapters are extremely short and may only consist of a couple of paragraphs, but they make a point that is highly focused and that is worth thinking about until you move on to the next one. So a big part of the book's argument is that the vast majority of people who are compelled to join a mass movement do so out of emotional satisfaction, and that reasons that they have for doing so are actually justifications in retrospect. These are not things they do because they have an actual logical plan for building a better world or for redressing grievances. They do it to feel more complete. They do it to push away a feeling of being hollowed out, of being dissatisfied, of not having the things that they were promised, even if those promises were completely hollow. All this got me thinking about how, when we write a science fiction and fantasy setting, there will often be room in many of them, especially, for instance, in dystopic science fiction, for mass movements and how they can be expressed differently in those settings. I'm thinking primarily about science fiction because a lot of what is discussed in this book, I think, can be more easily seen in the light of the modern or postmodern view which mass movements of the kind discussed in the book are more closely coupled to. There's a lot more discussion in the book of the mass movements of the last 100 or 150 years or so, rather than the mass movements of, say, the previous 1,000 years, many of which were religious in nature. So a fantasy setting, a pre-modern to modern setting, if it has movements that revolve around fanaticism, they're primarily going to be religious organizations. With a pre-modern setting, you don't have the same kind of thinking about the nation or the state that you do in a modern or postmodern setting. Where you do, it's usually in the form of something like a kingdom or an empire, rather than as a more sophisticated political entity like we would be familiar with today. Exactly the kinds of things that would be rebelled against by a mass movement of one kind or another. But it is still useful to think about what the book has to offer in terms of the psychology of the adherents, the psychology of the founders, and the people who also try to maintain such movements and keep them animated after they have already gotten started. Those are all still valid things to think about, even if you're not going to be putting them into the context of a mass movement that resembles something that's happening in the modern world. It's useful to know what makes these kinds of things tick, no matter what setting they're in. And when it comes to a modern or postmodern setting, I think there's also a lot to be discussed there that has a different flavor. In a modern or postmodern setting, there would be, for instance, probably a bit more of a sense that whatever the grievances in question are, they are not being addressed because they exist as legitimate grievances, but rather because they are a way to animate a mass of people to accomplish some larger goal. Another thing that might be really useful to people writing science fiction and fantasy in this book is the discussion, which comes fairly late in the book, of what Hoffer describes as the practical men of action. And the way he puts this is, a movement is pioneered by men of words, the orators and the instigators, so to speak, materialized by fanatics, and consolidated by men of action. In other words, a lot of what he talks about is not just how a movement gets started, but also how it can reach the commanding heights of power and then continue to perpetuate itself. One of the specific examples he gives of this is the communist movement, which seized the commanding heights of power in Russia and stayed there. Contrast this with the Nazi movement, which seized the commanding heights of power in Germany, but was not able to retain its grip on power, especially after it tried to wage war against literally the entire rest of the world. So if you're thinking about the constitution of a leader who can seize control of a mass movement and discipline it into something that will benefit their ends, you're going to find a lot to study from in this book towards crystallizing how somebody like that can work, what their thinking is like, what their aims are like, what they're really trying to do as opposed to what they say they're trying to do. All these things play directly into the emotional components that are the prime driving factors for a mass movement. So once again, the book is titled The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. And this is one of a number of books that Hoffer wrote in his lifetime, but it is the one that is most directly associated with his name. I am deeply intrigued at this point, though, as to what else he's done, and I do want to read his other works and see how well they also feed into our main subject. But I know this one is absolutely going to be worth your time. Whether you're writing science fiction or fantasy, it has a lot to offer for both of those perspectives. See what you think.